This is very exciting. Joining me on the Unsolicited Response show this episode is Richard Seiersen. Richard is the Chief Risk Officer at Resilience, but more importantly, Richard's an author. He's written at least 2 books, 2 that I've read. The first was How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, that he wrote along with Douglas Hubbard in 2016. And Richard, we actually had you down on the S4 stage, so I'll put that link up. But the reason I brought you on the show this time is you have a new book out. It was published in May of 2022, May of this year, the Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data. So Richard, welcome to the show.
Dale, thank you so much for having me here. And I really remember fondly my time in Florida. So it's great to see you again.
Yeah, it is. It's been a while. So I guess every time you write a book, I'll have to see you. So get busy, you know.
Okay.
It seems that way. I want to start out the same way I start out with any interview I do with an author, and that is asking you who you wrote this book for. Who was the target reader that you had in mind when you were writing this book?
This is going to sound profoundly self-centered. I wrote it for myself, or the person who's in the same sort of mindset and maybe experience as myself. And I can tell you more about that if you like,
Sure.
but that's my target.
Please.
Great. So I've been a CISO for a while. I call myself a serial recovering CISO, or Chief Information Security Officer. And increasingly, the gigs that I had were lots of software development, right? So cloud native and everything. I mean, I had, at GE, we're dealing with, devices that you put your body into and devices you put into your body. And then connecting those to the cloud seemed like a good idea. And then, of course, moving into companies that do increasingly cloud native sort of stuff. And as I looked at security and its ability to keep up with the speed of innovation, I was like, gosh, are we helping? I mean, are we helping the business, first of all? And is the security things that we're doing, how would we know they're helping? What would we see occurring specifically or empirically or mathematically, unambiguously, that would tell us that what we're doing is working? And that was just, a growing sort of question in my head. And of course, I wrote my first book, which is, again, very quantitative at the risk level. This was definitely much more rubber meets the road. And there were other metrics books that were out there. They're all great, by the way. They're some awesome books. But the thing that I was concerned with, well, what about the actual methods of measurement, right? And I started thinking about, who else has struggled to measure, seemingly hard to measure things. Who's done this before? And so I started looking outside of really myself and looking outside of what might be common to security to see who else was kind of struggling with questions like this. And lo and behold, scientists, people like that. And more generally, I'd call them measurement experts. And so, yeah, I, started learning and thinking, and somehow the book was born to bring all that together.
And you do go over that a little bit in your introduction, or kind of the start of the book. You talk a little bit about some of the experiences and how providing some of these statistics really opened some eyes in your customers and things of that nature, your clients and your companies you are working with. Yes. One of the quotes related to what you were saying, I had it for later in the interview here, but it seems very applicable, that I wrote down from the book. It said, "What would I see occurring that would let me know if it does work?"
Yeah.
And that, that whole idea of, we're doing all these things. How do I know if it's working or not? What should I be seeing if it works? I think it's a problem that almost everyone in the industry knows. It's been viewed as a very hard problem, and sometimes an insolvable problem, which you're going out to prove that it isn't. Now, in this book, the Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data, one of the things that was very unusual about it is about half the book is code.
Yes.
About half the book is R code with a little bit of shiny thrown in, which from a reader perspective is a little bit limiting. I didn't go through all the code. I did go through some modules just to get an idea what you were talking about, but I found myself skipping over a lot of it just in the interest of being ready for this interview. Can this book be valuable to someone who does not want to go through all the R code? Or if you said, I wasn't going to go through the R code, how would you instruct a reader to use the book?
No, that's a great question. For those of you who are listening, and it's in the book as well, but if you go to www.themetricsmanifesto.com, the code's all there, and it's set up by chapter, so it's really easy to go use and run. And the expectation wouldn't be that you would necessarily type it in the book from the book, but yeah, in the front matter and actually throughout the book, I try to give a lot of warnings to what I'd call concept-only readers versus people who are going to go and engineer through it. So I just got an email 2 days ago from a professor, actually out of Poland, who works for an international finance company, though, and he went through every single jot, every single tittle, and he said he was nice. He said, "This is fantastic, and here are the 2 errors." That's
wow,
great. Really specific.
Great, yeah.
With as much code is great. And so, yeah, I had to make a choice, and it was very conscious. Like, here I am, been an executive for a long time. What did I want? And the books that have really mattered to me are really like natural scientists. I read a lot of stuffs from people who are dealing with like kind of messy, hard to measure stuff. So natural sciences, whatnot. And where they actually didn't have math, but they actually had code in there. A lot of them tend to use R. Just some use Python, but mostly R. And I found again the idea of writing a book for myself. I found that really, really useful. So I wrote to that audience. Yes, you can read a lot of it. Well, I guess approximately half of it without going through the code. Yeah, but if you weren't expecting code, whoever the reader is, I could see them becoming incredibly frustrated.
Yeah, I don't know if frustrated. I did take something from the code without going through a lot of it, though. One of the things is it makes it real, right? You're not talking about something theoretical. You write the code, you show it runs, you show the results, you show the graphs that are created and such. And the other thing that was really surprising to me was, and maybe this was because I just went through the survival example at the beginning, I think it was like 5 lines of code. It was amazing how a small amount of code could achieve potentially big things in this book, which I don't know if that was one of your goals of proving, of doing it that way, but that was one of my takeaways from it.
Yeah, I mean, someone thumbing through it, they might say, "Hey, that's a lot of code," but actually, most of it's pretty pithy and relatively short. And by the way, that's because we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We're dealing with an open source package. There's been thousands of contributors, and so it makes our life easier. But I still tried to even condense that down. And the survival, the final graph on that chapter, and I use it again in the dashboarding. A lot of information packed into one little graphic with tremendous utility for security folks. And there's a reason why I put that chapter first. And that chapter, by the way, came before. So the book gets into Bayesian stuff a lot, but this chapter came right before it. And I wanted to have something that was short, had some interesting history in terms of the background, and would have immediate utility for the reader. So survival analysis, I think, is one of the it's one of the most important undone things in security. So what I mean by survival analysis is, typically in security, we'd say, hey, what's the mean time to whatever? What's the mean time to detect? What's the mean time to recover? What's the mean time to blah, 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 blah? And that's great. Well, if you think about, let's take vulnerabilities. I talk a lot about vulnerabilities throughout the whole book because everyone has vulnerability management, and it's just such a recurrent problem. So I do that. But what's the, you can have a vulnerability where you say, hey, the mean time to remove critical, remotely exploitable vulnerability. Just think, what are the nasty ones? All right. Our mean time for the remotely stuff is 7 days. So 50% are removed in 7 days. Okay. What about the 10% that are out in the edge? Well, that takes 90 days. And 1% takes 400 days, right? So if you don't capture the curve, the data, what happens is this: you can actually get better in your mean time. Like you can get your average can improve. You can go from 7 days to, let's say, 4 days. But that tail could actually get worse. And this is why it's important, because bad guys, they always attack the back of the herd. This is what they do, right? So you have stuff that's sitting out there. It's like fresh fruit for rotting vegetables sitting out there, and there will be more tactics and more techniques associated with those things. But if you're really not measuring that in your metrics, you're going to miss it. And so survival analysis is used obviously in it's epidemiology, it's used in insurance, it's hundreds of years old. And so, we want to measure like those people are measuring as well. Why not bring these really they're not ancient, but they're very old methods into security, and use it to really look at more of the data that look at more truth. That's why we do the Bayesian stuff as well. You're trying to look at more truth and ask those hard questions like, oh, is it okay that I go from 7 days to 4 days, but I went from 100 days on the final 5% to 400 days or more? I'm getting worse. No, that's not okay, because again, that risk is aging, and there's going to be more tactics, more techniques. It's out there flapping in the wind, and you need to be aware of it, because that's actually, for a CISO, if there's a breach of that, and after Mandiant's packed up their bags and gone home, and the lawyers are still there, of course, they're taking their money, but after it kind of said and done, people are going to look at that and go, well, that was knowable. That was to you might have said it's unknowable, but that was mitigable surprise. I mean, that was something that was knowable. You were negligent, you're fired, or something along those lines. And so our measurements need to be able to, just like a scientist would do, we want to be kind of conservative. That means capturing all the data to a certain extent, and even our uncertainty, and trying to bring that in and make better decisions. So that's why that chapter was first. Short code, more narrative, more history, more rationale. But in fact, I'd say to all of you listeners out there, if there's one chapter you read and there's one measurement you want to pick up, survival analysis. Do that. There's a lifetime worth of joy right there.
Well, I would say I got a lot out of that chapter, and then you had you went through the basically 5 categories. I'm not sure if you'd call them categories, but 5 different types of statistical measures, and burn down and survival, which was kind of the rate of removing risk from the situation. You define those, and then you had arrival and escapes, which you were measuring the success in stopping risk from materializing.
Yes.
But then the 5th one confused me a little bit, wait time.
Yeah.
Not so much, maybe you can give an example of a wait time example, but where does that fall in? Does it fall into one of those 2 categories, or is it a third category?
It's a third-ish. So let me explain the framework first of all, and then I'm going to explain that one specifically. Okay. So the framework, there's 5 measures, and it's called BOOM: baseline, objectives, and optimization measures. That's the whole framework. But there's 5 fundamental baselines, which you just articulated, which I'll say again. So there's survival analysis, burn down. Survival can shift left or shift right, but really in this case, it's for shift right, meaning it's measuring how well you're doing in taking care of risk that's already, that already exists. But so burn down is the same thing. That's a shift right metric. Then there's 3 shift left metrics, which are for measuring your preventative capabilities. There is the arrival rate, wait time, which is a subset of arrival, by the way. And again, I'll explain that. And then your escape rate. So escape rate, by the way, is a canonical measurement in software development. So software developers will be, what's the rate with which risk that moves from dev to production, that was seen in dev, but actually moved to production. So you don't want that to happen, and you want to get efficient at preventing that. So you have the escape rate. But escape rate can be applied to any sort of risk that's in a state of more containment and moves to a state of more exposure or less containment. So we measure that. But arrival rate is really critical. So wait times is a subset of arrival. So arrival is something we don't really measure in security, but it's key to measuring your shift left. So left of boom. Boom is like, think of military shift, left of boom, right of boom. Boom is when now it's something that's really exposed. It's in production. That's out there. So your arrival rate is what's the rate, like, for example, this month, what's the rate with which toxic things materialize, be they threats, be they vulnerabilities, whatever it might be. You want to measure that rate, and you want to start measuring that rate over time. So everything in the Metrics Manifesto looks at things as more of a time series. So what is that? And the idea is a baseline. When you're early in your measurement, when your data is sparse, your baseline will be pretty wide. You'll have a lot of variance in that. Over time, though, as you get more data, it becomes much more specific, right? And you get an idea of, okay, my capability baseline's here. So what's the rate with which toxic risk arrives? So it might be I use the example of critical vulnerabilities, and we use OSINT in this case. We use the National Vulnerability Database. We pull down all the JSON and do a bunch of analysis, and allows you to actually ask questions of that data. And so that's a useful utility, I think, that people should be using, by the way. But the idea is, what's the rate with which critical vulnerabilities materialize that I care about, coming from the NVD in this idea? Okay, they show up. They show up this much. Wait time is the time between the next bad thing. So in reliability engineering, actually in networking, actually in customer service as well, the wait time is a critical measure. So you're trying to understand what's the next time something bad will show up, and so you're looking to you get a baseline for that as well. So you can say, on average we have 30 things that materialize over time. If our shift left capabilities are better, we should see that reduce. The canary in the coal mine, though, for that measurement is the wait time, the rate with which the next bad thing tends to show up.
Okay.
So if your shift left protections are actually working, that would be the first thing you would see getting smaller. Anyways, it's huge, used large in operations management. It's a big measure, and again, reliability engineering and customer service. And so again, my view was not to introduce any new. None of these measures are new. None of them are unique to me. Most of them are roughly 100 to 150 years old. Most of them, and particularly since Bayes is such a huge part of it, that's 200 plus years old. Survival analysis goes back 400 years. My idea was, because I don't want to be the authority on which statistical methods to use, I want to say, hey, let's use these really fundamental, well-tested, well-tried components, right? If you think about it in engineering, like these components are really good, and let's apply them now to what's really the process of security, which is, again, you talk about shift left, shift right. How can you apply those in a way so that now we're thinking about the framework, when we're thinking about, okay, what is the evidence I would see of any security capability, anyone? How would I know it's working? If it's shift right, okay, I know what baselines to use. I can think creatively about that. Or if it's shift left, I know which baselines to use as well. So that was really the intent. Probably more than what you wanted to hear on that, but that was the goal.
Well, but I think it was a good overview for the listener who hasn't read the book yet to get those 5 elements of boom. And I will give you credit in the Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data. I enjoyed at the start of each chapter, you would talk about some of the historical references and who created what and who wrote what paper and what was published before they died and what other things they did. As someone who studied statistics more when I was a cryptanalyst, I really appreciated those. And you list a lot of books and references there that you could go down rabbit holes if you like this stuff. So that was entertaining. Now in the book, once we get past survival rate, and in fact, I think even for survival rate, you did have a phishing example in the book as well, but most of the examples had to do with either remediating vulnerabilities or preventing vulnerabilities, in the production development process somewhere down the line there. And I want to talk about how it could be expanded further than that. But when we just look at that, how do you deal with something, and this is maybe a broader discussion, but we see so much effort now in SBOMs, right? With people saying, okay, you found vulnerabilities in this product, but by the way, this product had, 500 other subcomponents, and now we're going to start looking at that. Your metrics are going to skew dramatically then. Is that just a phase shift as you add inventory, or is that tied to scaling that you talk about in the book?
So let me make sure I understand the question. So you're talking about the bill of materials. I mean, all the components that are associated with a given thing, right? So is that what you mean?
I'm thinking more of it as an asset owner. As
Right.
an asset owner, let's say I'm have these things in place. I'm looking at how I'm remediating vulnerabilities, how many vulnerabilities are arriving. I'm using the methods in your book, and then all of a sudden, instead of looking at vulnerabilities on this PLC or this engineering workstation, I now have all these subcomponents that I'm monitoring as well.
Right.
That yes, they were always in there, but I didn't see them before.
Right.
Is that something then that you would treat as, what you call scaling in the book? Or is that something where you just say, this is almost like a shift. We stop what we were doing before, we start over.
So let me feedback to what I think you're saying. So for example, I have a rate that I've developed in terms of, let's say, escape rates or whatever it is for a particular asset.
Well, let's do burn down. Let's do burn down, because that would be very,
easy.
very applicable to an asset owner saying, burn down, these vulnerabilities have come in. How many of them have I addressed within a certain time frame that I've agreed to in an SLA?
Yeah. In the last quarter, our burn down rate is, we're 95% efficient, right. And so over the past quarter, then and due to the nature of what you had visibility into, maybe it's the tools you're using or who knows what, but all of a sudden now you're looking at component level stuff below. Maybe we're just at software before, I don't know what it was, but all of a sudden now you've just opened this whole attack surface that you weren't visible to. And the question then is, okay, and then you find all of a sudden, boom, there's 100 things or 1,000 things.
Certainly the I don't know if it's probably the denominator. Certainly the number of issues I'm going to have to deal with could go up 5x or 10x.
Right.
Once I start that.
Right. So the purpose, and so I'm going to take this up one level, and then we can probably come down to this. So and I mentioned this in the book. The purpose, what I'm trying to look at is really, are my capabilities efficient, right? And, and one of the things we look at as well, you can talk about benchmarks, and there are some utility of benchmarks. I'm trying to understand, am I getting, you mentioned scale, am I getting better or worse essentially over time? So that's the question, like, am I efficient or not? If you have all of a sudden visibility into something that you didn't have before, so maybe some component level, and again, the question is it vulnerabilities in general, or do we want to get really specific? For example, you could say, are we talking about remotely exploitable stuff? Are we talking about stuff where you can only get at it if you are, if you have, admin access? Is it stuff where you have to be on the same network segment? Is it block? You can decompose to what makes sense. But the reality is, I'm trying to understand, am I getting more efficient at taking care of this thing that I care about, right? So I recommend that in the book is, again, I care about remotely exploitable that might deal with regulated data. I talk about that a lot, just to decompose. And I would apply that same thing here. So the question I'd ask if I was working with somebody is, okay, well, what is it that you actually care about? You probably don't care about all the vulnerabilities. You probably care about the ones that would lead to material loss, as far as you know. And I would be looking to measure those. If all of a sudden you had visibility into something that you didn't have before, that's your reality, and you need to measure that. I mean, we only know what we know. We only know what we can see. And if all of a sudden we have a better capability in scanning, or because of pen testing, or whatever the reason is, we can see more of the asset and its subcomponents, then that's where you are. And then you could be baseline.
Let's shift a little bit, because you use that word care, or that phrase care about, a couple of times in that answer. And it was funny. I wrote this down as I was reading that these aren't really measures of risk. These are measures of effectiveness of implementing security controls you deem important, is what I took from it. So
you're right. My first book dealt with risk. This one is the other side of the coin, efficiency.
Yeah. Okay. And so we have this issue, and this is why I want to look for some examples beyond patching. We have this issue in the OT world where there are some vulnerabilities that are very important. But there's also, if you were to take, let's say, a vulnerability on a PLC that, by the way, has unauthenticated firmware upload, you can basically do whatever you want with the device without a vulnerability. Patching those doesn't seem to accomplish much. And what we're actually seeing now in a lot of these tools that are trying to represent, they're actually trying to represent risk rather than effective implementation of security controls, is we'll see a display that will have number of missing patches, kind of like you have the displays in the back of the book. You talk about this, and you have them at different levels. But right now they'll show OT and IT, and OT will suffer miserably. One, because we're not patching, and some like myself would argue that's not where we should be putting our efforts. So I guess to turn this into a question, how would you advise the CISO responsible for OT and IT to provide this dashboard that seems to be in such demand that shows risk across the organization when in fact the factors are so very different? How are you advising people to deal with that? Because it's probably not unique to OT. There's probably other cases where they're very different profiles as well.
Right. So, and I'll try to, you let me know if I'm,
Okay,
not
sure.
hitting the target on this. Okay. But so the question is that you have OT and IT concerns. So it might be some, you use a firmware example, like I think they're like medical devices, right?
Yeah.
Where if you were to make a material change to what's on label, you could be in FDA, you have FDA problems. And so in short, QA problems. In short, you're not going to readily be able to make changes here. Yet it's something that could lead to a serious impact of potentially health or whatnot, let's say. But you can't just go willy-nilly do patches, make changes, or what have you.
Well,
Right?
let me stop you there because I think that one is that's even a different case and maybe a little easier. In this case, applying the patch will not provide you with risk reduction, even if it's rated as a severe patch, just because the device is so lacking in security. Like
Okay.
in a lot of the OT world, once you're inside the perimeter, you can do what you want.
Okay.
You don't have to find a vulnerability. So there are, I think I really liked it in your book how you focused on remotely exploitable types of types of vulnerabilities. Is it as simple as just better coming up with these categories of severity, um, that somehow you map OT severity so that it aligns with IT severity, or is there some other technique you would use?
So, so in the book, I talk a bit about the objects of. I believe I talk a little bit on the object of measurement, like what matters and what's important. So,
Hmm.
and again, if I were to consult with somebody, again, there's the risk side, and there's the we're definitely
Yeah.
Metrics Manifesto is definitely about being super trying to see how good you are at how efficient your capabilities are. But what I'm hearing from you in this case is like, hey, once you're past the hard, crusty exterior, it's a playground. You get to do what you want because you have these unauthenticated services, and you can pivot left, right, and no one's going to be able to stop you. So, and every time you scan that environment, you're going to see the same thing. Everything's wide open. And so, but yeah, there's nothing you can, according to what you said, there's nothing you can do. These are high availability systems, and you're not going to
No,
be able to affect
you
these.
could patch them. You could
Okay.
patch them, but they
Okay.
probably wouldn't affect risk. The fact that they're patched. I mean, if you can do everything you want to do, whether it's patched or unpatched, what's the value of patching? I guess
Yeah.
where I'm getting
So
at is we're
my
seeing.
recommendation is buy lots of insurance. I'm not
I
kidding,
guess
by the
what,
way.
yeah, I know. I guess what we're seeing though is on these dashboards, I'll go in and I'll see OT looks like a complete disaster and IT is only a little bit of a disaster. IT is showing progress. And so then the CISO looks at this and they say, oh man, the most important thing is for us to patch everything in OT because they've deemed that to be an effective security control. So how do you, I guess is it something just a matter of upstream identifying which things actually move the risk needle and then measuring those? The
Well,
problem is you're talking about different environments and they want to have the same measurement per environment and they want to display it on the same screen. And that's where we're running into difficulty.
yeah, but I mean, this is a risk management. I mean, again, everything in the book was how good am I scaling at taking care of the risks that I'm actually concerned with. If the if in effect, what you're saying is we have an environment where even if I do patch and whatnot, it's not going to really affect change in terms of risk. Meaning, if that environment were to get compromised, and if is the
Hmm.
big word there, but if that were, it's all bets are off, right? We're saying it's a, it's in theory we're saying it's a catastrophic risk. The systems could get in theory get shut down or disrupted in some way, and all bets are off. So in one sense, But the likelihood of that being able to happen because there, like as you said, upstream compensating controls are in place, then if that is the only move I can actually make that actually has material impact in reducing loss, then I'm going to focus on my efficiency there. Again, if I understand what you're saying correctly. Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, you did. I think it's just the challenge, and we'll get off this. The challenge is that CISOs are pushing. Now, some of them are more informed than others, but CISOs tend to like to measure. I shouldn't say all of them, but a lot of them tend to like to have the same measurements so they can compare things. So they can say we're doing well here, we're not doing well there. Why are we more or less efficient? So we're seeing very different numbers, and we're seeing, I guess, allocation of resources on things that, while not wrong, maybe are not where the money should be spent for risk reduction.
Yeah,
But
I think
I won't push you on that.
I don't want to leave that topic. Actually, I think that's really important. So, again, I've written 2 books. I wrote a risk management book, and I wrote a metrics book. And not both deal with risk. Don't get me wrong, but one was there are 2 sides of one coin. It was very purposeful. I felt incomplete. I wanted to write this other operational book. But the reality is that we're looking at about the efficient use of capital. And like if you want to go up a level to where CISO and beyond, if you look at the general counsel or CFO, they are responsible for risk transfer. Ultimately, their job is to say, hey, I'm going to, be it insurance, what have you. But my job is to make sure that we are able to, if there was a bad day to happen, that we can survive that, right? That we would have the financial resources in place, typically through insurance or otherwise, to hopefully to move on and do business, and that hopefully the likelihood of that impact would be small. So we want to do that. So given whatever the size of our limit is, right? And taking into consideration the value that's at risk. So in the case like Colonial, what was the value of risk there, for example, right? There's different things. So we want to understand our value at risk, right, as a distribution of potential losses. So it could be for a bank, it could be wire fraud, right? It could be because you're a bank and also you happen to have, let's say, a lot of PII, regulated data. And this is U.S. terminology, PII. Understanding the value at risk there, again, as a distribution of losses. So wire fraud, that disruption to business to serve. We need to understand all those things. Then we need to be able to understand what's the value of control given that, right? And that takes into consideration, in this case, it would be this environment that is essentially hard crusty exterior, but really soft in the middle. We need to understand all those things in relationship to the loss limits that we have in insurance, and ask ourselves over a multi-year period, 1, 2, 3 year periods, is what's, again, this is the tail of the curve, if what's left out there, is that within tolerance? Can we take a $10 million hit and pick up the pieces and keep going, or $40 million hit and pick up the pieces and keep going on? Or then what's the cost to solve that? Well, if the cost to solve that, to go into that environment you articulated, and it's going to be a 5-year, $50 million project or $100 million project, we have to ask ourselves, is the return on control there? Does that make sense? Do I need to buy more limit? Can I buy more limit? Or is my security so bad that no insurer will join me on this risk? They won't participate. They won't partner with me. And this is what, by the way, that's what I do for a living now. I do that. So it's the whole kit and caboodle brought together, building models to do all. I'm not trying to do the sales thing here. This is what I'm doing here.
Sure. No, I appreciate it.
I'm the chief risk officer brought on to build models and do all that stuff. So, but that's the real question. And so then the question, again, for someone looking at risk is, all right, do I have an inefficient capability, though, where I need it? And that's where the metrics come in. So that's the whole, bringing the whole picture together. So if I had an OT and IT environment, but the reality is, given the value at risk, that the controls necessary to protect the OT environment are efficient relative to the value at risk, then I'm not going to say, oh, and by the way, just because once I'm in the environment, I see 50,000 things, thou must go fix it. That actually seems negligent, honestly, from a business perspective. I think I'm coming alongside you and saying the same thing. Is if you're going to say that the cure is more expensive than the value of the business, that's kind of negligent too. So we need to be able to look at the full measurement. But if I'm just going to scan the whole environment, scan everywhere, and not take into consideration value at risk, not take into consideration where the most efficient control should be, and I'm just say, hey, we got 100,000 things, Dale, go fix them. No, I don't subscribe to that, and I don't know if I answered your question, but this is how we think about it.
No, I mean, that's very helpful. I think to me, what I'm hearing and what I took from the book was I really need to think about what I'm going to measure in terms of what security controls I actually think are important, and then I'm going to measure those. So rather than just take this broad-based sort of control, I might say, okay, well, how do I need to tweak that? How do I identify the assets or the types of vulnerabilities that I really need to worry about? We have a little bit of time left. I want to shift to data if we could.
Sure.
And here's another quote I just love from your book. Let me give you the title again: The Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data. The quote is, making immeasurability claims prior to actual measurement is a stumbling block that can lead us to stop measuring before we start. And I think, our probably overall security community is guilty of that. And certainly the ICS one is, because we say, well, we don't have much data. Right. There haven't been a lot of incidents. We can't do this. One of the things that struck me as, I guess, a little bit of a surprise in your first book, and then it was repeated here, was that you say that we should turn subject matter expert beliefs into data. Yeah. And you even say, if that sounds weird, don't worry, in the book, because I think to most people it does sound weird. I realize you covered a bit of this in the last book, but why do you propose, or why do you suggest that people interview their SMEs and use that as some initial data points?
Well, we do touch on this in the last book, but I talk about it a lot in the current book. Our job is to beat the competing model. So the current model for making investments in security, by the way, for the most part, is a form of collective intelligence that's typically like, what does Gartner say? Gartner's a pay to play, by the way, so very influenced, right? As a Forrester, or me looking to my left, looking to the right, talking to another CISO and saying, hey, what do you think about X, Y, and Z?
Right.
So we're already doing informal benchmarks to help build up our concept of what we need to do, right? So, what we'd love to have actuarial tables. We'd love to have the same thing we have for smoking and driving. But I think, those are homogeneous risks, where in security, we're dealing with fairly heterogeneous, and it's new, but we're dealing with fairly heterogeneous risks. And you have chaotic actors on one side, you have chaotic systems on the other, and here we are in the middle. And so, the question is, well, do I throw my hands up? Do I say it's impossible to measure? Well, if you say it's impossible to measure, you're actually doing one of two things. You're either lying, or you're making a declaration of complete incompetence. So when I say that, because you're hired to have expertise, listen, you don't know anything about, you probably, I don't know if you've been on safari or worked with large mammals in a zoo, or been a vet. You probably haven't done any of those things, maybe.
Right.
But you know something about the weight of an elephant. You do know something. And so, would I say, well, since you haven't been in any of these three things, therefore we have no information. So, I'm just gonna assume I can fit an elephant in my Pinto. No, you're not gonna do that. Same thing with security. We do know something. We're hired to be experts. And so we want to use subject matter expert beliefs. By the way, our book was required reading by the Society of Actuaries exam in 2018. Why is that? Because, insurance, they're going to sell policy and they don't want to lose their shorts. And so they're going to beat the competing model. When they don't have actuarial tables, they're going to use experts. Our actuary uses expert models. Our data science teams use expert models. They decided to hire an industry expert on that stuff to come and help them do it better. That's me. And so the federal government is a huge user of expert models for geopolitical events. In fact, Tetlock's book, right, Super Forecasting, was based on the Good Judgment Project. It was funded by IARPA. They had a competition, and they brought in these teams to compete. He had his team called the Good Judgment Project. He purposely used non-experts and trained them up, and using things like the Breyer score, which Breyer was a meteorologist from the 50s. So, a meteorologist used to be scientists. Now they're models. I don't know what happened there. But anyway, so using the Breyer score and train these people up who significantly outperformed the best NSA spies and others by 30%. The thing is, when you take an expert and you calibrate them and train them to be forecasters, they are excellent. Before they're trained, they're the worst. Doctors, lawyers, politicians, MBAs, they've been tested. They end up being really horrible forecasters. But when they're humbled and trained, they end up being great forecasters. So why wouldn't we want to use this data? Why wouldn't we hired for this expertise? Why wouldn't we want to use it? And if someone says, well, it's not usable, I'd say, well, you're making a claim that you've done some sort of information value test of entropy or whatever, and you've done some measurements and you've done repeated measurements, and you're here to say that it's not possible. Well, you have to argue with like Danny Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, 2003, and just a huge swath of researchers. You're gonna have to stand against science and say, I, security person, no, although I've never done any tests and I'm untrained and completely statistically illiterate, I'm gonna tell you it doesn't work, by golly. And I'd say, well, you're wrong.
Well, you even have an example in the book where you go through a process, and it's one of the ones that you code up and such, where you're asking two different subject matter experts for their viewpoint in terms of, I think, for the 90% range and another number, and they differ by not a small amount. I mean, they were both on I would say the more pessimistic side of the equation. One was just highly pessimistic about the success of implementing the patches, and one was moderately pessimistic. But you go through there and you show that even having these two different subject matter expert examples gave you another set of data that then you used in the model. So yeah, I was convinced, but I can see why that is a tough thing for people to deal with.
But they do it all the time. But they do it all the time, anyways. You know, we use, you know, wild arse guesses to go make purchases and make decisions all the time. We're forecasting machines. We do that, and we do horrible benchmarks by turning to the left, turning to the right, saying, what do you think? And the proposition is that, hey, you know what? When it matters, you can do better. And the examples, the main kind of idea of examples is, by the way, you can take their forecasts and then actually compare it to data, even small data, and determine who, given the data, given the model, who seems to have the better forecast. And let's use that for now. And obviously, when you have enough data, though, when you go from sparse data to more data, the forecast has less gravity or weight in the model, and that's natural. But when you're dealing with what would be critical risks, typically very small amounts of events, and you're looking to measure those and make better bets, this is a useful approach. Use your experts, calibrate them. Ideally, train them to be super forecasters beforehand. But yeah, use the experts.
The last area I wanted to talk about, and I don't know if there's a solution to this, but the book early on talks about the concept of process and hazards that can stop the process and such. And then once we get into it, we're actually talking again about the effectiveness of implementing these security controls. But coming from the OT world, a lot of what we do is process control. Like, we are trying to make sure this process works. On a crude level, is it running or not? But on a more sophisticated level, is it running within certain parameters, producing things of such quality, limiting variance and such? Is there, I didn't get it in this book, and maybe it was more of the first book, but it would be really interesting to be able to somehow tie security controls and the effectiveness of the security controls to reducing process impact, as we think about it in the operations world. A physical process.
Right.
Is that something that you're looking at, or is there a place in the book or your previous book that I should look at to focus on that? Because I think that's what a lot of people want to say, is they say, I could do all these hundreds or thousands of security controls over and over and again, but what I really want to know is which ones are actually preventing the things that I want to prevent. And that's where we struggle.
Well, I thought my book was a Bayesian book on statistical process control for security. I actually think it's Bayesian statistical process control applied to security, by the way, the current book. I really think it's that. And so, I mean, all the shift left measures are really about, getting telemetry, but you're measuring data generating process. So I talked about reliability engineering. I want to refactor here. So if you think about reliability engineering, you think about observability really from like statistical physics or whatever. Observability is the idea. You have some black box process. There's a lot of stuff going on in there.
Yep.
I don't know about all that stuff, but there's stuff going on in there. and there's telemetry being emitted from that process, right? I might know a few things, I might know about a few components, whatnot, but I have telemetry. Can I use that telemetry to make some inferences about the efficiency of that black box process? And then can I use that telemetry and that idea about efficiencies then to perturb that system and make it better, right? And so that's observability. And that's really what, honestly, a lot of the measures, I'm not a scientist, right? I'm just another operational guy banging rocks at the bottom of the salt mine. But I think that's what I'm intending, for this, is that you're looking at a data generating process, you're doing measures of that time series, right? And you're trying to say, okay, based on this, let's make a change, and then let's observe the telemetry. So that, I don't know if that lines up with what you're thinking, but I always thought of it as a Bayesian statistical process control for security. So there you go.
Well, so we have, I mean, what you're talking about is our world. I mean, these are control systems. So they are getting that telemetry, using it to make decisions as to how to control or modify the process, and there's control loops, and there's all these people. That's what they do for a living.
Yeah.
Now, what we don't run into is a lot of numbers in terms of security incidents affecting the process. Right. So that's where we have a real, going back to this data concept, that's where we have a real problem with the data, because we have a lot of, these are high impact, low frequency events. Right. So we can't necessarily say, look, we have experience that these security controls have reduced the likelihood of this event happening in our process control system at this rate. We just don't have that data. Now, right. we can use subject matter experts to estimate that data, but the learning curve to put some analysis on that data, just so far, I don't see that happening. Is there a way that we should be approaching this in terms of generating data? Because you go over that in the book quite a bit, simulations and such.
Yeah. I don't know. This might be, honestly, this might be a good question for my Doug, who wrote the foreword to this book, but also my co-author from the previous. I'm his co-author, and I definitely wrote side saddle on that book. He's the measurement generalist expert, as you know. But what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we don't have a long run high frequency of compromise events, whatnot, where we can associated with the environments that you deal with, the OT environments that you deal with day in and day out. We have other things that are making noise that we can measure, right, about the efficiency of components and whatnot. But what we don't have is just a long run frequency of events. So therefore, we can say, okay, well, so we're going to have a hypothesis. Our hypothesis is we're going to take X, Y, and Z actions, security. We're going to do security things, right? And maybe it's configuration management, maybe it's patching, maybe it's some other sort of inline sort of stuffs. They're going to do something. And our hypothesis is that if we do these things, it's going to reduce the likelihood and perhaps impact of some event. Yet, it may be a long time till we even knew whether or not that thing had any impact. So in the environments where we have like near zero telemetry, which is what I think you're heading at, that's definitely material for the first book. I mean, that's like Doug, trying to determine the value of drought resistance in the Horn of Africa. How do you measure that? Well, it's not necessarily a whole lot of telemetry there, so you have to use forecasts. And I think that could be the same thing here. Again, if you're dealing with almost near zero telemetry. The confronting security with data hypothesis is that you have some hypothesis about the efficiency of some security capability that you've invested in, and you do have data. How do you then use that data to confront whether that thing's actually efficient or not? And that's that. Again, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but that's
no, you are, and I think that just kind of to loop around here. So this current book, the Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data, I think provides many good examples and a way to approach the idea of measuring the effectiveness of implementing security controls you've considered to be important. Yes. And that's, you should spend time, anyone should spend time analyzing whether what they're doing is really important or not. That may be still difficult to do in our environment just because, we don't have a lot of data, and we probably won't. A lot of people have never had a security incident on their system.
That's a great, by the way, that is such an important thing to say. So I had a group of CISOs. I did a training during RSA. I do cyber super forecaster training. It was free. Had a bunch of, fancy CISOs in the room, and I said, "Hey, raise your hand. How many of you have had a ransomware event where it was public, meaning so there was exfiltration of data, so you're forced to do state-based reporting, and you paid a claim, and on top of that, you paid the actual ransom where you actually had a so what I'd call real ransomware." How many of you? And these are so this is over 100 years of CISO. These are like myself, 20 years, whatever. These are really experienced folks. Not a single hand raised. And I said, "Well, how about business email compromise?" There's only one hand that rose in the room. That was mine, right, where I dealt with a sizable one. I think people sometimes forget, and again, that's just a biased sample, right? But I think sometimes when we think about these things, our industry, the security industry, they're selling stuff. They're really trained to make you think the sky is falling constantly everywhere, and the media doesn't help. It is real. Don't get me wrong; it's real. That's why we need to measure our using experts oftentimes and making sure they're calibrated. So the purpose of the training was calibrating, and they got calibrated. They got really good at this stuff, and we used a whole platform to test them, whatnot. Much more than what the Tetlock did with super forecasting. By the way, we go way beyond that, and it's free. So the thing is, you get these experts, use them, right? But you also need to bring in the value. What's the value at risk? Meaning, what's the monetary value of things you're protecting? So that when you have limited data, or maybe you're using experts, you understand the value risk that you understand, be it third-party risk or first-party risk. Then the cost of control. You can, the medicine, the cure may be worse than the disease. And it really is being risk managers, as the CISO is really part of the C-suite as a risk manager. That's really our job to not just say, oh, everyone waves a chicken over their head to cure the pox. We need to wave chickens over our head. No, let's look at what the value of control is relative to the value at risk, and let's make a reasoned argument. Again, this is when you don't, this is the more of the risk management sort of thing. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good way to sum it up. The book is by Richard Seiersen, The Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data, obviously available on Amazon and wherever else books are sold, bookstores, Barnes and Noble, I'm sure. The site itself, you've mentioned it is the title of the book, The Metrics with an S, the metricsmanifesto.com for those of you listening rather than watching. And the code's there and a lot of other information is there. Any last plug or suggestion for someone who might want to look at this book?
Yes. My suggestion is this. Our field of security is still very nascent. And if you look at any serious kind of STEM related field, the thing that distinguishes all of those fields, let's say from security, is this. You would never go to someone doing statistical physics or someone building bridges or someone making drugs, right, or whatever, and say, "Hey, you ever thought of doing measurement?" It would never happen. There's no not measurement. It's just part of what you do in engineering, where instead that is what you do. Is you do that. In security, the question is, well, should we do metrics or not? Just realize that any real domain of endeavor has to go through the sieve of measurement. And we are still in the early evolutionary stages of security, still kind of actually crawling out of the primordial ooze, as it were. And if this field is going to become a real discipline and real field, and I say Dale probably gets this because he's number theory and encryption and all that, he gets this. We're going to have to get there. So call it statistical process control for security, whatever. All this has to really happen. And so I want to encourage you to look at the other serious domains and look at what the claim I just made and ask yourself if you're doing that. And if not, what stops you? Get measuring.